Marcus Harlan had always been described as the kind of man who lit up a room without trying. At the community center where he worked, parents often spoke highly of him, praising the way he seemed to have a special talent for connecting with children. He was the one who volunteered to stay late for after-school programs, who showed up early on weekends to run sports events, and who was always ready to lend an ear when a kid needed someone to talk to. To most, he was the heart of the youth center, someone who seemed genuinely invested in the future of the kids around him. His calm smile, patient voice, and friendly approach made him a fixture in the community. For years, he carried himself as a mentor, a role model, and a trusted guide. What no one could see on the surface was the carefully crafted mask he wore. Behind the warmth and helpful demeanor was a man whose intentions were far from noble. He had positioned himself exactly where he wanted to be, close to children, trusted by parents, and shielded by a reputation that made it almost unthinkable to question his actions. The role of a counselor gave him not only authority but also access, and Marcus knew how to use that to his advantage. Every act of kindness, every gesture of generosity, wasn't just about helping, it was about building a wall of trust so thick that no one would imagine looking behind it. The community center itself was the perfect setting for someone like him to blend in. It was a place buzzing with life, filled with the laughter of children running through hallways, the sound of basketballs echoing in the gym, and the hum of activities designed to keep kids safe and engaged. For parents, it was a haven, a place where they could leave their children without worry, knowing Marcus and the other staff were there to supervise. For Marcus, it was an opportunity disguised as responsibility. He had become an expert at making himself indispensable, ensuring that his presence was always welcomed and never questioned. Marcus's colleagues admired his work ethic. He rarely called in sick, and when others were too tired to cover extra shifts, he volunteered without hesitation. Parents noticed his reliability too, and many would go out of their way to thank him for being there when they needed help with childcare. His reputation grew over time, becoming so strong that people began to see him as more than an employee. He was a trusted figure in the neighborhood, someone parents spoke of with gratitude and children often talked about with admiration. And that image was exactly what kept him protected. But even the most polished mask can hide cracks. Certain behaviors, though subtle, hinted at something darker. He seemed to prefer situations where he was alone with children rather than in group activities. He often arranged extra sessions that parents assumed were about mentoring, tutoring, or helping kids with sports practice. While these offers were framed as acts of kindness, they placed him in situations where he had more control and less oversight. At first, no one questioned it, because why would they? This was Marcus, the man who had never given them a reason to doubt his intentions. His dual life was a balancing act, one that required precision and constant awareness. To the outside world, he projected reliability, patience, and warmth. To himself, he nurtured a darker side that he believed would never come to light. Marcus understood how people thought. He knew that in communities where trust ran deep, suspicion was rare. Parents wanted to believe in people like him, because it gave them peace of mind. And he exploited that fully, weaving himself into the very fabric of the community so that the idea of him being anything other than good seemed almost impossible. Still, there was something in his demeanor that made a few people uneasy, though they couldn't explain why. A teacher at the local school once noticed how Marcus seemed too focused on certain children, but she brushed it aside, telling herself she was overthinking. Another parent felt a brief moment of discomfort when her child mentioned how Marcus gave them special attention, but she dismissed it, convinced it was nothing more than harmless kindness. These small suspicions came and went like passing clouds, never lingering long enough to cause real doubt. For Marcus, this was proof that his strategy was working. He thrived on that trust, feeding off the admiration and respect that gave him cover. Every smile, every thank you from a parent, and every cheerful greeting from a child reinforced his confidence that he was untouchable. He moved through the community like a man without fear, convinced that his secrets were safely locked away behind the strong shield of his reputation. But while Marcus felt secure, cracks were beginning to form beneath the surface. What he didn't realize was that the very position he had built to protect himself was also drawing attention in ways he hadn't anticipated. He was always present, always eager, always available, and sometimes, being too perfect invites questions. Though he couldn't see it yet, small seeds of suspicion were beginning to grow, and the carefully constructed image he relied on was not as unshakable as he believed. His story, at this stage, looked like one of success and admiration. To those around him, Marcus was the embodiment of trust and kindness, a man who worked tirelessly for the good of children. But in truth, this was only the beginning of his downfall. His time in the spotlight wasn't the triumph he thought it was the stage being set for the shocking revelations and devastating consequences that were soon to come. It began with a small detail, one that almost slipped by unnoticed. A mother had picked up her son from the community center after one of the late evening programs. Her child was cheerful, as usual, but casually mentioned that Marcus had insisted they spend extra time together in his office. He explained it as a mentoring session, something meant to help him improve in school. The mother brushed it off at first. After all, Marcus had always been praised for going above and beyond for kids, and most parents saw these one-on-one moments as proof of his dedication. But the thought lingered. Why would a counselor need so much private time with one child, and why did it seem to happen more frequently than with others? When she brought it up to another parent, the response was simple: Marcus is just dedicated. Everyone knew him as the man who gave more than required. But for this mother, instinct refused to stay quiet. She decided to voice her concerns to the local authorities, not because she had evidence, but because something felt off. That small step, just a single phone call, was the spark that started the investigation. Detectives began their work quietly. At first, there was little to go on. Marcus's record was clean, his background checks spotless, and his reputation nearly flawless. But investigators didn't stop there. They turned to the digital world, combing through platforms where predators often hid behind usernames and fake profiles. It didn't take long before they found something disturbing. Marcus had been using multiple online identities, each crafted to appear younger, more approachable, and in some cases, deceptive enough to lure unsuspecting kids into conversations. The discovery sent chills through the investigative team. It was one thing to suspect unusual behavior, but now they had evidence of deliberate actions. Under these aliases, Marcus engaged in conversations that revealed his true intentions. He wasn't just interested in mentoring kids, he was obsessed with gaining access to them in ways no trusted adult should. His conversations showed patterns of grooming behavior, carefully crafted words designed to break down barriers and build false friendships. To the children on the other side of the screen, it might have felt like innocent chatting. To detectives reading the transcripts, it was a clear sign of manipulation. What disturbed investigators most was how Marcus's online life connected back to his real job. In several of his messages, he hinted at his access to children through his position at the community center. He bragged about his trustworthiness, about how parents never questioned him, and about the opportunities his role gave him. It was no longer just suspicion, it was proof that Marcus was using his job as a shield, presenting himself as a safe adult while secretly exploiting that trust for his own purposes. The more the detectives uncovered, the more dangerous the situation appeared. Marcus had positioned himself in a role where he could monitor children closely, identify vulnerabilities, and offer special attention that seemed harmless on the surface but was rooted in darker motives. They found patterns in the way he selected which children to spend extra time with, often choosing those who were shy, struggling academically, or going through difficult times at home. These were the kids who craved support, who would be most grateful for the attention he offered. Still, investigators knew that exposing someone like Marcus required more than circumstantial evidence. His reputation in the community was strong, and without undeniable proof, parents and colleagues might refuse to believe the allegations. They needed something that would leave no room for doubt. So they expanded the investigation, tracking his online activity more closely, monitoring the times and places where he accessed certain accounts, and slowly building a timeline that connected Marcus's double life. In doing so, they noticed how calculated he truly was. Marcus often used devices that didn't belong to him, borrowing computers under the pretense of helping children with schoolwork or setting up programs for the center. He thought this would make him harder to trace, but investigators were patient. They collected data quietly, waiting for the moment when the pieces would all connect. Over time, a chilling picture formed. This wasn't a man who had slipped once or twice into questionable behavior. This was someone who had been carefully constructing a secret world, one that coexisted alongside the smiling face he showed parents every day. As weeks turned into months, the file on Marcus grew thicker. Screenshots, message logs, and behavioral patterns filled page after page. The evidence painted a picture of a predator hiding in plain sight. And yet, to the outside world, nothing had changed. Marcus was still the same man leading games in the gym, offering advice to teenagers, and greeting parents with a smile. No one suspected that every evening, after the center's lights dimmed, he was stepping into an online life that revealed his darkest intentions. By the time the investigation reached its peak, detectives knew Marcus couldn't be left unchecked any longer. He wasn't just talking online, he was making plans. Plans that hinted at meetings, at private encounters, at opportunities he was ready to take if he thought the timing was right. The line between fantasy and action was blurring, and law enforcement understood the danger. Every day he remained free was a day children were at risk. The community, however, had no idea what was unfolding behind the scenes. Parents continued to praise him, children continued to run into his office excited to share stories, and staff members continued to see him as their most dependable colleague. But while he moved through his days with the same calm confidence, investigators were watching his every move, recording his every step, and preparing for the moment when his carefully guarded world would collapse. Marcus believed he was untouchable. The truth was, the walls were already closing in around him. The signs that had once gone unnoticed were now part of a larger picture, and the man who seemed like the perfect counselor was about to face the consequences of the life he thought he could keep hidden forever. The decision to set up an undercover operation was not made lightly. Detectives had gathered enough information to know Marcus was a serious threat, but they also understood that in order to secure a conviction, they needed undeniable proof that would stand up in court. Everything had to be done carefully, without tipping him off. If Marcus sensed for even a moment that he was being watched, he might erase evidence, change his behavior, or slip further into hiding. And so, the plan was put in motion, an online sting that would lure Marcus into exposing himself in ways he could not deny. Investigators created a convincing digital persona, carefully building the profile of what Marcus would believe to be a vulnerable teenager. They gave the account believable details, photos that appeared authentic, and conversations that seemed natural for someone that age. Then they waited, letting the fake profile exist in the online spaces Marcus frequented. It didn't take long before he reached out. He thought he was initiating contact with a teenager, but in reality, he was stepping into a trap that had been prepared specifically for him. At first, his messages seemed casual, almost innocent. He asked the kind of questions any adult might ask a child about school, hobbies, and family. But detectives recognized the patterns. This was how predators worked, starting small, testing boundaries, and gradually steering the conversation into darker territory. Each day, his messages grew bolder. He began complimenting the supposed teenager, telling them they were mature for their age, suggesting that they keep their conversations secret. To the officers monitoring in real time, it was the chilling confirmation of what they had suspected all along. Marcus's behavior followed a familiar script, one investigators had seen before in similar cases. He worked to create trust, to convince the teen that he was someone who understood them better than anyone else. He dropped hints about the private office at the community center, bragging about how no one ever questioned him when he stayed late with kids. The arrogance in his words was striking. He seemed proud of his ability to hide in plain sight, as though his role in the community gave him an untouchable shield. He didn't know that every keystroke was being captured, every message archived, and every word bringing him closer to exposure. As the conversations deepened, Marcus began suggesting in-person meetings. He tested the waters, gauging how far he could push. Each suggestion was carefully logged, adding to the growing body of evidence. Detectives played along, careful not to rush, careful to let him reveal his true intentions on his own. They understood that patience was their greatest weapon. The longer he talked, the more reckless he became, and the more ammunition they would have when the case finally went to trial. Meanwhile, investigators kept surveillance on Marcus's real life. They monitored his routines at the community center, noting when he arrived, when he left, and how often he arranged one-on-one sessions with children. They observed the way he operated in public, always with a calm and controlled demeanor, always the dependable counselor. To anyone watching from the outside, he was the same Marcus he had always been. To the detectives, he was a ticking time bomb. The sting operation lasted several weeks, and during that time, Marcus's confidence only grew. He began sending messages that left no doubt about his intentions, messages that were graphic, detailed, and damning. He wasn't just fantasizing, he was actively planning. Detectives knew then that the time to act was approaching. They had the transcripts, the recordings, the evidence of his attempts to exploit both his role at the center and his imagined connection with a child. All that remained was to choose the moment when the trap would be sprung. The hardest part for the investigators was maintaining composure as they watched his behavior continue in real life. They saw him laugh with children, shake hands with parents, and earn praise from colleagues who had no idea what he was doing behind the scenes. Each smile, each handshake, each word of trust made the reality harder to stomach. But they had to wait. Acting too soon could compromise the case, leaving room for doubt or defense. The sting had to be airtight. Behind closed doors, prosecutors and detectives began preparing the legal groundwork. Warrants were lined up, charges were drafted, and strategies were mapped out. The undercover officers knew that one mistake could unravel months of work, and so they rehearsed every step. The goal was not just to arrest Marcus but to do so in a way that left him with no escape, no defense strong enough to overcome the mountain of evidence against him. Finally, the plan reached its breaking point. Marcus had agreed to meet what he thought was a teenager, believing he had successfully convinced his target to trust him. The meeting location was discussed in coded terms, but investigators understood exactly what he meant. This was the proof they had been waiting for. It was the point where fantasy became action, where intent became undeniable. The sting operation had achieved its purpose. For Marcus, the conversations were thrilling, a secret world that gave him a sense of power. He had no idea that each message was another link in the chain tightening around him. For investigators, the operation was proof of the dual life he had been leading, evidence that could finally rip away the mask he had hidden behind for so long. He believed he was in control. In reality, he was walking straight into the final act of a plan designed to end his deception once and for all. The stage was set. The officers had the evidence, the prosecutors had the case, and Marcus had unknowingly given them everything they needed. What he thought was just another step in his hidden world was actually the beginning of the end. Soon, the trusted counselor, the admired figure, the man parents believed in, would be exposed not for who he pretended to be, but for what he truly was. The undercover operation had done its job. Marcus's downfall was no longer a possibility, it was an inevitability. The morning of the arrest began like any other day for Marcus. He arrived at the community center early, carrying his usual thermos of coffee and greeting staff members with a smile. He moved through the hallways with the same calm confidence that had become his trademark, stopping to check on activity schedules and chatting briefly with a few children who had arrived early. To everyone around him, it was just another weekday, another chance for Marcus to play the role he had perfected. He had no idea that as he unlocked his office door, a team of plainclothes officers was already stationed nearby, waiting for the signal that would bring everything to a sudden end. The operation had been carefully planned for weeks. Detectives wanted the arrest to happen at his workplace, in the very place he had built his reputation. They knew the symbolism would matter, the trusted counselor taken down in the environment he had used to shield himself for years. The decision was also strategic. By arresting him at the center, they ensured he would not have time to destroy evidence or attempt to flee. Everything was prepared with precision, down to the minute. Inside the building, investigators blended in seamlessly. Some posed as maintenance workers, carrying tools and clipboards. Others dressed casually, as though they were parents dropping off children. Their presence was unnoticed by staff who were busy preparing for the day's activities. Outside, unmarked vehicles were positioned at every exit, engines running and radios ready. The community center looked as peaceful as always, but beneath the surface, it was the site of a high-stakes operation. Marcus went about his routine without a care. He set down his coffee, checked emails on his computer, and arranged papers for the afternoon program. He didn't notice the subtle changes, the extra faces in the building, the officers moving closer, the staff members who had been quietly briefed and guided away from the area. He was comfortable in his role, convinced that nothing could break the trust he had built. That confidence made him blind to the storm that was moments away. When the signal finally came, the move was swift. Officers entered his office with precision, identifying themselves as they closed in. Marcus froze, caught between shock and disbelief. The man who had always been in control suddenly had none. His smile vanished, his hands trembled, and his carefully constructed image shattered in an instant. He was ordered to step away from his desk, and before he could gather his thoughts, his wrists were locked in handcuffs. The same hands that had been used to shake parents' hands and pat children on the back were now restrained, the symbol of his authority stripped away. The scene was a mixture of chaos and silence. Some staff members gasped as they realized what was happening, unable to believe the man they trusted was the target of a police operation. Parents who had just arrived to drop off their children stood frozen, struggling to process the sight of Marcus being led away. The children, confused by the sudden commotion, whispered questions that no one knew how to answer in the moment. For years, Marcus had been a fixture of safety in their lives, and now he was being escorted out of the very building that had seemed so secure. Detectives wasted no time securing the evidence. His office was searched immediately, with warrants ready and waiting. Computers, hard drives, and phones were collected. Drawers were opened, files inspected, and every corner examined for materials that could link Marcus's double life to his professional world. The evidence collected that day would only strengthen the case, adding physical proof to the digital trail he had left behind. For Marcus, there was no escape. He was escorted past the familiar hallways, past the children who had once greeted him with trust, and past the parents who now stared in disbelief. Each step he took was heavy with the collapse of the life he had built. The mask he had worn for so long had been ripped away in the most public way possible. His arrest wasn't just a legal action, it was a spectacle, a moment that shattered illusions for everyone who had believed in him. Outside, the flashing lights of police vehicles replaced the ordinary calm of the morning. Neighbors gathered at the edges of the parking lot, drawn by the commotion. Whispers spread quickly. Marcus, the counselor, had been arrested. The story traveled faster than the officers could escort him into the waiting car. By the time he was driven away, the community was already buzzing with shock and confusion, struggling to make sense of how someone so trusted could be hiding such darkness. Back inside, the atmosphere was heavy. Staff members tried to reassure children, but their own expressions betrayed their unease. Parents exchanged worried glances, wondering how long Marcus had been deceiving them, wondering if their children had ever been in danger. The community center, once a place of comfort, now felt tainted by the reality of what had just unfolded within its walls. For investigators, the operation had gone exactly as planned. Marcus was in custody, evidence was secured, and the case against him was stronger than ever. But even they couldn't ignore the weight of the moment. They had arrested many suspects before, but rarely in a place so intertwined with trust and innocence. The sight of children watching their counselor being led away in handcuffs was something that would stay with them long after the case was closed. Marcus sat in silence during the ride to the station, his mind racing. He had believed he was too clever, too careful, too protected by his reputation to ever be caught. Yet here he was, his carefully built world crumbling in a matter of minutes. He had been caught not in some distant, unfamiliar place but at the very center of his life, at the job that had given him access and cover. The irony was brutal. The community center had been his greatest weapon, and now it had become the stage of his downfall. The arrest at work marked the turning point. Marcus was no longer a respected counselor, no longer the admired figure parents spoke highly of. He was now a suspect in handcuffs, exposed for what he truly was. The operation had ended his double life, and from that day forward, every headline, every whisper, every memory of him would be linked not to the trust he once inspired, but to the betrayal he could never undo. News of Marcus's arrest spread faster than anyone could have imagined. By the afternoon, the community center was no longer a place filled with laughter and play, it was swarmed with reporters, parents demanding answers, and police vehicles coming and going. The quiet neighborhood that had once held so much trust in Marcus was now buzzing with disbelief. For many, it felt like waking up in a nightmare. The man they had welcomed into their homes, the man they had trusted with their children, had been hiding a dark double life all along. The shock turned quickly to outrage. Parents questioned how someone like him could have passed background checks, how no one had noticed sooner, and whether their own children had been put in danger without them even realizing it. Authorities worked quickly to release details about the charges, carefully choosing what to disclose to avoid damaging the case while still calming a panicked community. The evidence collected was overwhelming: digital conversations, messages filled with intent, and physical devices seized from his office and home that left no doubt about his guilt. Each revelation was worse than the last. Parents who had once praised him now felt sickened at the thought of how close their children had been to someone capable of such betrayal. The image of Marcus as a role model was gone, replaced by the reality of a predator who had hidden behind a mask of trust for years. In court, the story unfolded piece by piece. Prosecutors laid out the timeline of the investigation, showing how Marcus had carefully manipulated his role to get closer to children. The transcripts of his conversations were read aloud, each line exposing the calculated way he had tried to lure what he thought was a teenager into a meeting. The courtroom was silent as the words filled the air, each sentence a reminder of just how dangerous he truly was. Parents sat in the gallery with tears in their eyes, some holding hands, others covering their faces as the truth became undeniable. Marcus, once confident and charming, looked hollow and defeated. The same man who had stood tall and proud at community events now sat hunched in an orange jumpsuit, avoiding eye contact with the people he had betrayed. His legal team tried to argue for leniency, suggesting he had not acted on his plans yet, but the evidence painted a different picture. The messages, the explicit intent, the abuse of trust, all of it pointed to a man who had carefully prepared to cross a line he should never have approached. The sentence, when it came, was severe. Marcus was given decades in prison, a punishment meant not only to ensure he could never harm another child but also to send a message that those who exploit positions of trust would face the harshest consequences. For some parents, the decision brought relief, knowing he would never return to their community. For others, the relief was mixed with guilt for not having noticed sooner, guilt for ever believing in him, and guilt for allowing their children to spend time in his presence. The aftermath was felt far beyond the courtroom. The community center was forced to re-evaluate its entire system of background checks and oversight. New policies were introduced, requiring stricter monitoring of staff, additional security cameras, and mandatory training sessions for employees to spot warning signs of grooming behavior. What had once been seen as a safe haven now carried the burden of suspicion, and it took months for parents to feel comfortable leaving their children there again. Trust, once broken, was not easy to rebuild. For the children who had known Marcus, the confusion was even harder to process. Some had seen him as a mentor, someone who helped them with schoolwork or cheered them on during games. To suddenly be told that he was dangerous was a concept many struggled to understand. Counselors and psychologists were brought in to help families explain the situation in ways children could process. It became clear that the damage Marcus had caused went far beyond his crimes. The emotional toll on the community would linger long after the case had closed. The story gained national attention, serving as a chilling reminder that predators often hide in plain sight. News anchors repeated the same unsettling point: Marcus had been the man no one suspected, the man everyone praised. His ability to blend in so perfectly made the case all the more disturbing. Across the country, parents, teachers, and youth organizations began re-examining their own safeguards, asking the uncomfortable but necessary question: could someone like Marcus be hiding among them too? For investigators, the case was both a victory and a heavy burden. They had stopped a predator before he could carry out his plans, but the weight of what they uncovered stayed with them. Some admitted privately that the sting operation had been one of the most unsettling of their careers, not because of the evidence itself, but because of how easily Marcus had fooled everyone around him. His arrest proved that even the most trusted figure could be living a double life. Marcus's name became a cautionary tale. Parents used his story to teach their children about boundaries, about the importance of speaking up if something felt wrong. Schools and youth programs cited his case in training materials, showing staff how predators could manipulate appearances to gain trust. His downfall was not just the end of his own life as he knew it, it became a lesson for countless others. In the end, the case was about more than one man. It was about the fragile nature of trust and the vigilance required to protect children from those who would exploit it. Marcus had believed he was untouchable, but the very reputation he built became his undoing. When the mask fell, the truth was impossible to ignore, and the consequences were swift and permanent. His story left behind a community scarred but stronger, determined never to be blinded by appearances again. The arrest at his workplace was more than just the moment he was caught, it was the moment an entire community woke up to the reality that evil can hide in the most trusted places, and that sometimes, protecting the innocent means questioning even the people we think we know best.